So, good afternoon. Thank you all for sticking around for our second panel on our policy track, Securing Our Connected World. So, over the next few days, you're going to hear a lot about IoT and 5G, the benefits, the potential, and how we win the race to 5G. But for the next 50 minutes, we're going to focus on security. So, strong cybersecurity is key to the U.S. global wireless leadership. And I am grateful to be joined by such a stellar panel of experts that will help us to discuss some of the big security issues right now. So immediately to my left is Evelyn Remaley. She is the Deputy Associate Administrator for the Office of Policy Analysis and Development at NTIA. Next to her, we have Chris Boyer, who's Assistant Vice President for Global Public Policy at AT&T. Following him, we have Drew Morin, who's the Director of Federal Cybersecurity Technology and Engineering Programs at T-Mobile. And to round us out, we have Elizabeth Rojas Levi, who's Senior Director of Public Affairs and Government Relations at Nokia. So thank you again. And we have a lot to cover, so we'll just go ahead and jump right in. So IoT, when we think about the Internet of Things or IoT, security is top of all of our minds. There's, throughout government, on the Hill, and in industry, everybody's looking at it and thinking about it. In the very near future, we will have tens of billions of connected devices. Depending on which estimate you look at, some say over 50 billion by 2023. So as we think about the future of IoT, the promise of that with smart cities and autonomous vehicles, et cetera, it's important that we also think about security of those devices and what can and is already being done to secure the devices. So Chris and Drew, let's kick it off with you if you wouldn't mind, to sort of level set what the threat landscape is for IoT right now and a little bit about what the wireless is already doing.
Want me to start?
Chris? Yeah,
sure.
We'll start.
Well, first off, thank you for having me here today. It's a great event, and so I'm very happy to be here. In terms of what the industry is doing around IoT security, there's been a lot of work that's been done over the last several years. I mean, ever since we saw the Morin botnet that kind of brought all this stuff to attention a couple of years ago, there's been quite a few different developments. So one of the things that AT&T has been doing, we've been working with some of our partners, and we created an IoT security alliance that was launched a couple of years ago, where we've been working on putting together different IoT solution sets. There's also a work that GSMA did where they put out security standards for IoT, whether it's the device, whether it's the network, or the application layer. CTIA just in the last, a couple weeks now, launched the IoT certification and testing plan that CTIA is doing, where we're going to test the devices and validate that the device has some level of security. So I think when you add all those things together, the industry is taking a lot of actions to drive better security, both for the devices and for the rest of the IoT ecosystem.
Thanks, Chris. And Drew?
Yeah, thank you as well for having me here. This is a great forum for this discussion and for this interaction, great panelists to share the stage with. You asked about threats, and I think one of the key things we need to do when we're talking about IoT is to consider the components there that we're addressing. When you look at the Internet of Things, you've got, as you mentioned, the potential of billions of devices. So there's a very large, if you will, attack surface at that point in time. But beyond that, when we start to roll out these Internet of Things, we're going to have the connectivity between those devices, the radios, the core network, and then how that core network connects into the information services. And so you have a broad community that's involved here. And as Chris noted, we've been working together, T-Mobile as well as the other carriers, with CTIA, with GSMA, on standards to address certification processes to provide a certain benchmark for how these devices should be tested to raise that bar. But as well, we've been working on standards within 3GPP as well as GSMA on how these are going to connect to the network, how they're the different paths, whether it's narrowband IoT or whether it's going through the basic data pipe, user plane if you want to, how it's going to connect from there all the way through gateways and into ultimately the service provider. So there's a lot of work that's been done in industry around all those different components that do represent the areas of threat. Because anytime you open up a device or a new platform, of course, there's going to be an attack surface and the potential for threats.
No, thank you. That's helpful. And Elizabeth, if we can turn to you. I know Nokia has done a lot of work recently related to the development of smart cities. So the same question to you, what is the threat environment as it relates to smart cities, and what is industry already doing, and what needs to be done?
Yes, so thank you as well for having us here. I promise I'm not texting, but I'm just looking at my notes. So the smart cities environment is really interesting because there's not truly a smart city yet, right? There's different pilots all over the world. And what I tend to say is that there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. There's a lot of technologies. There are a lot of players, government, private sector, and we are digitalizing different verticals. So you have, if you imagine a smart city, you will have smart parking, smart lighting, self-driving cars, a smart hospital. All of those industries are very, very different. So one of the things that we discovered is that the human-centric approach of analyzing threats in the network is just not feasible because there's so much data moving around. So what we're investing like crazy is on automation, data analytics, and machine learning in order to spot some of these threats in the network. And we have acquired a lot of companies, including Safeguard, which is a software company, and we're doing a lot of other things in that realm. So lots of technology investment and playing with new players.
Great, thank you. So Evelyn, let's turn to you, and as our sole government voice, I promise not to pick on you throughout the panel, but NTIA has done a lot of work related to IoT. Last year you all released the IoT Green Paper. This year you released your botnet report. So do you take a minute and sort of, for those in the audience that maybe aren't as familiar with the botnet report, what you all looked at and what some of those recommendations were?
Sure, absolutely, and thank you for having NTIA today as well. We always appreciate being here with industry to talk about the government perspective. As Melanie said, yes, at NTIA we worked last year under Executive Order 13800 on a botnet report for the President. We were assigned, along with our partners, NIST, who's also part of the Department of Commerce, along with NTIA, and the Department of Homeland Security, to take a look, to work with industry, to run an open and transparent process to look at the issue. This was following Morin, which Chris mentioned, so there was a lot of attention of how IoT was changing the ecosystem, the environment, and even though we had implemented things over the last several years that we had thought were effectively looking at the botnet issue and problem, and we were doing well on mitigation, we realized at that phase that the environment was changing, and so really the perspective of the report was for industry and government to come together, civil society to relook at the issue and say, what should we be doing so that we can map to the current environment. And so we took a year to look at that issue. We used requests for comments. We had several workshops bringing industry and civil society in to talk about the current environment and to talk about what we needed to do as a community to get better at this threat and this problem. We published a draft report of all of our recommendations last January, and then we published the final, submitted that to the President in May of 2018. And basically, the report focuses on 5 high-level goals that the community needs to work on together to make this issue better. But the one thing that was difficult about the report is that we came up with over about 24 action items that the community needed to work on. But it was really hard to develop that prioritization. Resources are always being competed for. We knew we weren't going to be able to accomplish everything at the same time. So one of the findings coming out of the report is that we would come back to the President in 240 days with a roadmap actually mapping out how the community was going to move out on those action items. And so that's actually the process that NTIA is currently in with NIST and DHS, looking at how we really as a community can map out the action items that were developed through the report. And there are 4 to 5 focus areas coming out of the process. We're looking at recommendations around IoT, what technical and policy changes we need to make in that space to have a more secure environment. We're focused on recommendations in the infrastructure area, enterprise recommendations, and then also recommendations around adoption and awareness. And we're just about done in our process of pulling those action items together. One of the main areas that we're focused on right now is baselining security requirements in the IoT space. So, both of my industry colleagues have talked about developing certification regimes. One thing that we're trying to do under the botnet report process is come up with that baseline, and so that's one of the first activities that's spawning other activity under the report. We plan to publish the roadmap at the end of this month to get community feedback and to finalize that, and then we owe that roadmap to the president in November, and then we'll report back to him in a year on how the community has been progressing on implementing those recommendations.
No, thank you. That was helpful. And so, Chris, if, following up on the discussion of botnets, you work with the NSTAC on behalf of AT&T. So you all put out a very thoughtful report last year, also focused on botnets, and it also included some recommendations and an idea for a cybersecurity moonshot. So do you want to take a few minutes to sort of walk through some of those recommendations, how they align with what Evelyn and her team are doing, and sort of the status of where we are on?
Sure. So for those not familiar, the NSTAC is the National Security Telecommunications Advisory Council, and it's a federal advisory body that reports at the pleasure of the president. So we do reports on different national security, cybersecurity related matters on a periodic basis to the White House. And so last spring, after the executive order that Evelyn mentioned, 13800, the NSTAC was tasked with doing a preliminary report on botnets that would serve as kind of a preliminary version that would feed into the work NTIA was doing. So we put together a working group and had somewhere around 25 briefings from subject matter experts and had several companies involved, and wrote a report that was issued last, I think it was in early November when it was finally done. It included a lot of different recommendations. We broke them down between different segments of the industry. So there were recommendations for internet service providers, recommendations for devices, and specifically around the IoT issues, recommendations for software and application developers, and also for our enterprise businesses and consumers. So we tried to segment it out and say, here's a few things that can be done in each one of these areas that would kind of raise the bar for overall security in preventing botnets. And it's a lot of the usual suspects. Like a lot of what is in the report I would characterize as incremental change. So that's kind of where the cybersecurity moonshot comes into play. So the idea in that report was, we kind of all know what we need to be doing, so how do we just get there? Like, how do we get some of these things implemented that we already know probably should be implemented? And so that was really a lot of what you'll see in that report is not rocket science. It's simple things like, if you're rolling out a device, let's make sure that it doesn't have a default password of password or something like that. And if you're building out a network, make sure you implement some basic, anti-spoofing controls or, different types of network security controls that are all kind of standardized. That's all kind of incremental gain. The moonshot is about how do we leapfrog that and get to a more kind of fundamentally secure underlying internet architecture that's more resilient from the get-go, so that when we're building out services and devices and other things, that the internet itself is a vehicle for better security, as opposed to what we do now, which is kind of bootstrapping security on top of what is otherwise could be viewed as a very complex architecture that has security flaws, by its nature. So I think that's what the moonshot is trying to get towards. Whether we'll get there or not is debatable. The moonshot report's supposed to be out later this fall, so we'll see how that goes.
No, that's great. And so both Evelyn and Chris, you both mentioned baseline security. And so as Chris mentioned, last month CTIA announced its IoT cybersecurity certification program. And we collaborated with the members of our cybersecurity working group, which included AT&T, T-Mobile, and Nokia. The program will provide certification for cellular connected IoT devices and also those devices with a Wi-Fi connection. And so let me kick it to you three, since you worked with us, on what your thoughts are on the value of industry-led programs like this, and sort of what you see for this program moving forward. So Drew, you've been quiet for a while over there. Let's go to you.
I was just fading into shadow here.
Okay.
So the program itself, obviously we worked with the carriers and manufacturers, the entire community, to try and lay out, if you will, a baseline capability and a tiered system of certifications for these devices. The objective there was that industry has a great understanding as to what are the constraints as well as the capabilities. And we figured that we could really work with the community to make it so it would be a successful capability that could be leveraged. T-Mobile, we focus on it from the standpoint of how do we continue to do the best we can to protect our customers. And if we're talking about a device that's gone through a certification process, similar to the way that our handsets currently go through a radio certification through the CTIA labs, that gives us a baseline from which to work from. So we're looking at these devices as being certified through these CTIA labs that we can then leverage before we have, and so our engineers can focus on the really detailed vertical functionality testing, feature testing, and pen testing that you need to do to ensure the security of these devices. But we don't have to spend the cycles doing what are the basic blocking and tackling type of testing, since these labs are very good at doing that. So it allows T-Mobile as a company and the others who are beneficiaries of this type of a capability to take some devices, ensure that there's certain baseline processes, procedures in place, and these are based on tiering, based on the type of application that the device would be used for. So for example, something that's, monitors your coffee pot might be considered a tier 1. You just want to make sure that it's got some basic cybersecurity. But something that might be for a pacemaker would be a tier 3. There would be a lot more intrusive testing at the certification level. And all of that saves it so that we know what we're getting from a baseline, and then we can start looking for more extensive challenges and opportunities to address cybersecurity issues for these devices. And part of it I understand as well is the companies involved here, especially from the mobile carriers and the manufacturers, if you want to think about what is probably the best designed IoT device in the markets today, it's the cellular phones you all are carrying. They are tested, they are certified. These devices have got regular maintenance updates that are put out. If a cybersecurity issue is identified, it's corrected, a maintenance release gets pushed out. All of this type of best practices is already in place there. So we knew what we were getting into, and we figured how can we bring that capability to the broader IoT universe. Now, the other part of this is going to be a challenge for us is how do we, I know I'm not stopping now. I was quiet for a minute, but it's too late now. The other challenge we have now is how do we take this and make sure we educate the consumers as well? Because they need to demand this in the marketplace. They need to say, I want to know that when I'm buying a camera, that camera has gone through a certification process. It does demonstrate best practices, and not that I can get it for $15 off the internet. So there's going to be this give and take, and I think where we are now, the consumer is much more educated already, and as we continue to work industry and government together, I think we can really get that education going and create a demand-side pull, which is really the other part of this, making this program successful.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, back into the example of smart cities, you have so many different types of devices, and they have all been evolving at a rapid speed, right? So the certification program is very positive for us because it embeds security by design from the beginning of the sensor, and that is in line with the security by design principles that we have for 5G networks. And I think a great example is the Ukraine outage of their smart grid in 2015. You had 250,000 people affected. They had an electricity blackout, and it was a cyber attack that came out of nowhere. So these types of certification programs really protect everything from the sensors to the network level. And for Nokia, this is fantastic because we're playing in all of it.
Chris, do you have anything that you want to?
I think they largely covered it, but I mean, I will say that I think there's lots of different certification programs that are emerging. You know, the CTIA program, which is focused on particular sets of devices. You also have work going on at other entities, like the Underwriters Laboratory is working on a program. You've got the Consumer Technology Association is looking at these issues as well. So I think there's a lot of effort around in the industry side around creating these types of programs so that those device makers that want to demonstrate that they're fulfilling some basic security criteria, you know, will have the vehicle in which they're able to do that. And I think from a service provider standpoint, you know, obviously the devices are a critical issue in terms of securing the network. You know, there's been, ever since Morin happened, there's been a lot of concern that some of these devices can be turned into effectively bots and facilitate some of these things like DDoS attacks. And so how do we create kind of a critical mass where there's at least some basic security being built in? I think that's a worthy goal, and I think these programs are going to help do that.
No, and Evelyn, if we can just turn to you for a minute. So the botnet report mentioned the idea of having sort of industry-led baseline security.
Right.
And we, you know, when developing the program, we looked at some of the security recommendations from NIST and NTIA. So I don't know if you've had a chance to really look at the test plan and look at the program, but what value do you see, and you know, you included it in the recommendations, in these sorts of industry-led initiatives?
Right. So two things I'll focus on in response to that. And one is, you know, I just think that this is such a positive demonstration of what we can do when we work together, government and industry. The program, one thing that we're really focused on at NTIA is trying to build markets around security. And so we do focus a lot on something that we call the multi-stakeholder process, where we bring stakeholders in to, again, civil society, industry, government players together to work on hard security problems that, for whatever reason, haven't been able to be solved in the marketplace. And sometimes, you know, it's because it's a cross-sector problem and the right players aren't talking to one another, or it's something that there are so many solutions that have been put out there that there's maybe the market just isn't taking it up, and we haven't really identified why one solution isn't sort of moving forward. And so we try to bring the right players together to talk about those hard problems if the market's not working to forge a path ahead. And so last year we did have a multi-stakeholder process that was focused on IoT patching, and out of that process we developed, the stakeholders developed several documents. One was focused on communicating to consumers, how manufacturers, how vendors can do that, just to let consumers know if the product is going to be patched, if it is going to be patched, how they can actually do the patching, where they go to get it, how that's going to work, and third, how long that product is going to be supported. And so kind of 3 easy best practices that stakeholders came together to agree on that could work cross-sector and across different platforms. And so it's, you know, the whole idea of bringing stakeholders together to work on those issues is so that they then lead and can inform other efforts that industry is taking on themselves and consider that and put it in. So that it's nice to see that that is happening, and that's really NIST best practices are meant to inform that as well. So it's nice to just see that working, and then on the other side of that, the botnet report, you know, we at NTIA and Commerce fought very hard to make sure that that was a piece of the executive order that was done in an ecosystem-wide way and in a collaborative way, that we couldn't do it alone. We needed all the players to be part of that discussion to forge the path ahead. But knowing that some pieces government needed to perhaps catalyze or initiate or own themselves, but for a lot of it, it really needs to be industry moving out and determining solutions that are going to work for them in the marketplace. And so developing baseline security standards, was one of the first action items coming out of the report that we noted will require government and industry collaboration. But really, we noted in the report that the certification regimes, that's really where industry is going to lead and the market is going to decide, and various sectors are going to do different things. Home products might do something different from a healthcare product, and the market needed that flexibility to be able to develop that. So again, it's pleasing to us to see industry, market, the stakeholders already starting to move out on those action items under the report.
Great, thank you, and we're excited about it, and we're glad that that you all are pleased. We like when you're pleased. So before we move on from IoT, what are some of the unique challenges? And we touched on a few of them, but just the quick 30-second overview of what do you see as the unique challenges with IoT that we haven't necessarily seen before? And Drew, do you want to kick this off?
Sure, call me up.
30 seconds.
30 seconds. Very straightforward. I'm going to say the unique or the big challenge in IoT is going to be the scale of the devices and the number of devices and the differences in the devices, because it's not like one single threat exists. Each one of the devices has their unique threat vectors, their unique attack surface. So I think that that's probably the key challenge for the device side of IoT.
That's a good one. Chris?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think scale and complexity are the two biggest challenges.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge is that we are now working across industries, so we really need to be industry experts to manage some of these security threats, the IoT side.
And Evelyn, from your perspective, do you see anything that's different in the IoT world?
So I will just say on this one that what I view as one of the biggest threats is just that the stakes are so high right now because of IoT just having such an impact across our society, across what we're doing globally. And so the stakes are high, and there are a lot of eyes on the impacts. It's no longer just, someone's computer might go down. We're talking about real physical, real world impacts that we can see here. And so there are a lot of eyes on this. And so at NTIA, this is why we've been working so hard to make sure that the collaboration is occurring. And that we're signaling and showing progress, because that's extremely important. And what I worry about is that, and things are moving in the right direction with the botnet report, and other developments are happening. I worry about something big happening, and that we haven't had a chance to show the good innovation and the progress, how we're working together and moving in the right direction. We need to avoid those trigger fingers where we don't let the market innovate around the best security practices. And so I worry about that, but I think we're headed in the right direction with the collaboration that's happening.
If I might add, it's great to hear that point coming from the government side, because I think as an industry person, that is our biggest concern as well. As in, Washington has no tendency to knee-jerk, right? My God. So like the biggest concern we have is that something will happen, and there'll be a knee-jerk reaction that will lead to either really heavy-handed regulation or other types of outcomes that will stunt the growth of the marketplace. And one of the reasons why we've always had a good working relationship with NTIA and the Commerce Department is they have the dual-headed role of ensuring both commerce and security. So there's got to be a balancing act there. And I think the concern would be that and part of the reason these certification programs are so important is because they demonstrate that the industry is out there trying to really drive some of these solutions in advance of the next Mirai or the next big thing that happens, which could lead to potentially a knee-jerk reaction.
No, that's a great point. And so let's move on and talk about 5G a little bit. So I think it's been stated that the U.S. networks are among the safest in the world, and the wireless industry works diligently to generation after generation to improve the security each time. And so today's 4G LTE networks have the most advanced security, and 5G will improve upon that. So Drew, would you take a minute and sort of walk us through what is the unique threat landscape for 5G, and what are you guys already doing and looking at to make sure that it is secure?
So everybody's going to think that all I'm about is threats. So no, that's not the case.
No, you're not, but you're my good baseline. Explain it to me like I'm a kindergartner.
So I think part of why the question was asked of me is that I'm a member of the working group in the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, Communication Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council. CSRC is what we call it for short. It has to have an acronym for everything. So what we just finished is we just completed drafting a report to the FCC commissioners, and it'll go through this council, and it's for recommendations to the FCC as well as to industry on how best to secure 5G network. And the way that we looked at this, and it included industry, government, manufacturers in addition to carriers, we looked at the 5G infrastructure. We said, okay, how do we break this up and communicate clearly what the threats are? And to begin with, there's the classic Ozzy Osbourne, how many Gs are there? So when you look at 5G and you try to find cybersecurity experts in it, 5G is not deployed anywhere right now. So there's really nobody who's attacking a 5G network. So you have to start looking at the components and breaking it apart. So you look at the radio side of it, and 5G defines a new radio. So what are the types of attacks you can expect in a radio? You can expect jamming attacks. You can expect man-in-the-middle type of exploitation, things of that nature. So we look at what have we learned from 4G. What have we learned from 3G? What have we learned in Wi-Fi? And we start looking at these threats and figuring out what are the best practices to mitigate those types of threats. And there's a tremendous resilience in 5G in terms of new radio too, jamming because of the different frequencies and the multiple frequencies it operates on simultaneously. There's tremendous resilience to man-in-the-middle because of the encryption between the device and the radio network. So then you start stepping in from there into the core of the network, and you look at how this core is going to be implemented. And I'll tell you right now, we had a big challenge with that because within the core, 5G core of the network, the standards are not yet written or not yet locked down and completed. It won't happen until the end of 2019. So we had a little bit of a challenge in that area. So what we did is we started looking and saying, okay, when carriers first deploy these 5G networks, they're going to do it on a 4G core with the 5G new radio. So what does that mean from a threat perspective? And you look at it and say, what's going to change? Well, you're going to have things that are going to be exposing services. Okay, if you're going to have a smart city, well, it's going to have some kind of application programming interface within the carrier core that those devices are going to talk to be able to get to the service provider. So we broke this project down into Internet of Things technologies. We looked at the APIs and the services that are going to be provided and how they're going to be secured. And we started looking out into the information technology arena. And we found that these are known problems in the IT arena that can be applied in terms of a 5G architecture. So we were talking earlier, Chris and I, about how do you define 5G, because it's not just an evolution of 4G. It's not like more bandwidth. It is 3 different types of networks in one plus, if you will. And so you have to really understand the different types of components of information technology that are brought in terms of virtualization of the network, software-defined networking, how that's going to be implemented within the core. We're doing that today in 4G. In the LTE core. So we have a lot of places that we've learned about these different types of capabilities and where they come in from. And the report has been drafted up. It's got a lot of great recommendations. I don't want to be a spoiler. It'll be presented to the council at the end of the month of September and voted on, and it'll be published publicly after that. But it does really provide a good assessment of everything from radio to core all the way out to even the interconnectivity with the information services.
Great. No, and we will all certainly be looking for that report when it comes out later this month. So what are some of the enhancements to security that 5G will offer? So I know there will be a privacy enhancement and other things. Chris, do you want to lead us off on that?
I can start a little bit, and I'll let Drew kind of fill in some of the blanks. But I mean, at its most fundamental level, I think 5G is the first time that in the standards itself, like in the 3GPP SA3 process, that we are able to actually build in security from the outset of the standard itself. So I think, in a way, we're learning from our experience in the previous network deployments that we've done, and there is a security mechanism built into the standards, whether it's specific things like the way the encryption is done, or other types of security components of the standard itself, but it's being built in from the ground up. And so a lot of people talk about 5G and how they raise all these security concerns, and I would actually flip that dynamic and say that 5G is actually an opportunity to build a fundamentally more secure architecture. There are some things that are different, depending upon your perspective. Some people argue that, like, for example, that you can push some of the intelligence closer out to the edge of the network. We've heard arguments that creates, security concerns. I would argue that's actually a security benefit, because the closer you get to the edge, the more you can apply the network against those devices, the more you can monitor traffic and apply network security techniques. So at the end of the day, I think 5G is an opportunity for us, and you can't just look at 5G, I think Drew was making his point earlier, like monolithically as just 5G. It's also happening at the same time that we're going through evolving our packet cores with things like software-defined networks and network function virtualization and other techniques, that at the end of the day, that the holistic network that's going to be created out of this, the 5G network, the SDN network, they're all going to be fundamentally, at least in my view, they're going to be more secure. It creates a more secure networking environment in the long run, despite some of the ongoing debate we're having in Washington right now.
So some of the key things that we're doing in the 5G specifications already is the idea of better securing the confidentiality of user identity, and this comes across the network. There are a lot of different ways that your device and your SIM chip, if you will, presents itself to the network for authentication. In 5G, it's going to be much better encrypted. It's also going to prevent in terms of standards, say you're not supposed to downgrade the network you're on. So it prevents somebody from forcing a downgrade of your device to a 2G, which is a lot easier to exploit. So there's things like that. These are lessons we've learned over the years are being applied in the standards process for 5G. And that's just one simple example. As Chris mentioned about the idea of the multi-access edge computing, you can do a lot of things by pushing this intelligence out to the edge. Yeah, it brings slightly different challenges, but we've already figured out the challenges of physically protecting edge computing. We've got it because we're protecting our radio network sites and we're instrumenting them, and so we're already on top of how to do these types of things. So that's going to be within the standards, within the specifications, and within our policies and practices for securing it. Network function virtualization and software-defined networking. The idea here is that eventually you're going to get to the idea of network slicing. That's not going to happen day one, but it will eventually happen within the network. What that means is I can actually define a specific virtual function for a specific purpose and a specific service. So if somebody attacks that streetlight function, for example, well, it may harm that function within the carrier network, but it's not going to have a cascading effect against the rest of the network. It'll only attack that slice. The slice is instrumented. I see something bad happening there. I can turn down the slice. I can spin up another one. And as you talk about machine learning and AI, that's going to help that to become automated in the future, so it automatically spins up. These, now, once again, we're talking 2020 to 2025. These are emerging technologies, but we're not going to see a lot of these core capabilities or these features and functions until that time anyway. So I think that, as Chris began his statement, this is the first time as an industry we have really looked at from the bottom all the way to the top about security across this entire network, and it's designed in, and it's going to be the best, most secure network.
That's great.
Yeah, I will add from the vendor's perspective, when you look at a threat, it is the identification of the threat and the response of the threat. So on the identification of the threat, the most important part, at least for 5G, is the technologies that you're embedded from the beginning. So I'm a little bit repeating what you're saying, but currently it's very manually centric. You have like a security room full of engineering manually trying to see where the threats are coming in the network level. What we're trying to do now is diminish that, use data analytics, automation, and machine learning to spot those threats a lot faster and then respond immediately. Then the policy side will come into place because we can embed all of these smart analytics and AI and whatnot into the network level. But we also need very flexible frameworks in order to respond. So you want to identify quickly and respond very quickly. And I think with 5G is the first time that we're all coming together and looking at these threats and response together. So it will be a lot faster. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And Drew, you touched on some of the standards, and we all know that global standards are vital to enable the dynamic, resilient, and safe wireless networks and to counter some of these threats as we move forward. So I think we heard from Drew that the standards aren't expected until 2019.
Can I
yes,
be very
please.
clear? There's the 3GPP comes out in releases, and 3GPP is defining these specifications that turn into the standards that we build to and deploy to. So release 15, which is frozen now and basically is considered done for all intents and purposes this year. That's the one. It really does define the new radio and focus around that aspect, which means that we can start getting the radio networks being and the radio equipment built and tested, and devices as well.
Which we're currently doing.
Right, which is why you're seeing announcements.
You've seen all the announcements with AT&T, Verizon, and all of that.
And
We're
T-Mobile.
deploying, of course, all of you guys. So yeah.
So you're seeing that right now. Release 16, which comes out is targeted for the end of 2019. Release 16 is about the rest of the core of the network and also non-terrestrial services, which is kind of an interesting thing with 5G. Is it's more than just terrestrial wireless. So you'll see that in December 2019 is kind of their target. That's going to mean, if you're thinking about the way you deploy 5G, when I said before, you're going to deploy it with the new radio, but with the LTE core. That's how everybody's going to go that way. And then in 2020, once that new core is defined and locked down, you'll see new cores being able to be deployed. So 2020, 2021 is when you're really going to see that next generation of core coupled with the new radio, and we're going to start seeing what is called standalone 5G, which is an all 5G type of system. So this is kind of neat the way we're deploying it as well. We are deploying it incrementally, even though it's an evolutionary type of technology.
No, great, thank you. So Evelyn, let me turn back to you. NTIA has spoken a great deal about the importance of U.S. involvement in the global standards development, and especially as we move to build the 5G network. So what role do you see for NTIA and for government to play in these standards development?
So let me just sort of pivot a little bit because, I want to talk because, we were just talking about IoT, and I think it's really, IoT is going to be such a large part of the 5G environment. And so, in the botnet report where we take on IoT quite a bit, standards was a large focus of that report, and we definitely heard from stakeholders that commented on our RFC and participated in the process that they were looking for more collaboration between government and industry on cybersecurity standards in these emerging spaces. And so I would say overall, NTIA is very involved in 3GPP and 5G standards that are moving forward. The security part of it is something that we're tracking very closely. But the picture is larger. It's about cybersecurity and how we're doing standardization on this broader scale as we're moving into these other emerging areas. And so one thing that you'll see coming out of the roadmap, the botnet report roadmap, because this approach that we've worked as a community on that's coming out of the botnet report, even though it's focused there, if we're able to implement the actions and meet the goals that we've set out, the impact is going to be much higher. And so, it's about 5G and the standards there, but it's a larger picture. And so one of the recommendations is about how we, government and industry, can be working better together in terms of being strategic, identifying the right standards development organizations where we're going to be at, and then making sure that industry, who's leads in these environments, has the government support to do the work that they need. So.
No, thank you, and that is a great transition into, I wanted to talk a little bit about collaboration. And the wireless industry certainly values the importance of information sharing and collaboration, both within industry and between industry and government. And 50 minutes goes a lot quicker up here than I was anticipating. So with our last 5 minutes,
we're chatty people.
So with our last 5 minutes, do each of you want to take just a minute to sort of your final thoughts, and if you could focus on sort of the importance of cross-sector collaboration that's been mentioned, and industry collaboration with government and vice versa. Just some sort of final thoughts before we lose the stage to the next panel.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start. So I think it's interesting because we've talked a lot about certifications and standards, but truthfully, I think collaboration goes way above that because the U.S. market's a very sophisticated market, and not every market in the world has the same technological and policy expertise. So we really need to leverage international organizations, the United Nations, OAS for the Americas, even World Economic Forum. We need to use all of these international quasi-government and non-government organizations to come together and bring leaders, everyone from the ministries of telecommunications to private sector, and even local, state and local officials, because the threat is so large, and again, it's going to really hit every single side of our economy, that we really need to come together and discuss these issues. And the other thing is not to treat privacy and security completely separate. I know this panel that we were talking about is mostly cybersecurity, but privacy is also important. We have GDPR developing in Europe. We have California in the US. But really, the way that you collect data, utilize data, and the way the governments think about that data and their citizens could also be or not be a security threat. And lastly, threats are global, right? So we need to find a global mechanism to go after these guys. So if I'm being attacked in the US, but my attacker is, in country X, we need to find a global mechanism to hold that actor accountable, because they're acting outside of the government. So there's a lot of collaboration needed at the global level, and especially because of the magnitude of these threats these days.
Thank you. And Drew, we'll just move down the line.
Okay, when I look at the idea of collaboration, industry and government, I think that it's a mutually beneficial relationship we need to have, and what that really translates to is something akin to what you all had said earlier, which is it shouldn't be one side telling the other my way or the highway. It should be, how do we get together and figure out what we each have, how do we share it so that each of us can use it to best execute what is within our sphere of influence. And I think that that's the big challenge that as we go through these new standards around IoT, as we go through the standards in 5G, and as we deploy these new networks, is continuing to share information and continuing to collaborate and continuing to realize that just like with any other relationship, there's a certain voluntary aspect of it, and we want to keep it that way and not have it be dictated in either side. And I think that that's a very important aspect of it.
Yeah, I think cybersecurity is actually one of those kind of rare issues in DC where everybody kind of has come to a consensus that it requires a partnership between government and industry to really deal with the problem. There seems to be a growing recognition that most of the infrastructure is frankly owned by the private sector. So in order to really effectuate a cybersecurity policy for the country, there needs to be a partnership with the industry. It's going to be much more productive if industry is sitting at the table with government and working with them collectively on dealing with these problems, and if it is government agencies kind of dictating the rules of the road to the industry itself. So you have everybody in the boat with you. So I think we've made a lot of progress in the last 5 or 6 years and kind of moving in that direction, and things like the NIST cybersecurity framework that was developed, and some of the other joint projects that we've done, the botnet report and the various Instack reports and other things are examples of how we've been trying to partner with government to you kind of raise all boats, right? Get everybody to a certain level of security. You're never going to totally solve the problem. It's just the nature of what we're dealing with. But I think what we can do is make everybody a little bit more secure by doing that. And I think the partnership model has been working fairly well. It's never 100% perfect. Like there's always going to be certain issues. There's, one of the big issues in security is making sure that all the agencies are kind of collaborating with each other, because there's a lot of overlapping in other, projects that are going on, especially around, our favorite issue these days, which is the supply chain concerns. But I think everyone really has the right intention of how do we really work together to try to make this better.
Great. And Evelyn, final word with you. Yes, you get the last say today.
Yay. I would like to just emphasize the adaptability piece of this, and which I think sums up a lot of what my colleagues have said. We have seen, you mentioned GDPR. I mean, we are seeing around the world a lot of these other sort of top-down, heavy-handed approaches. And, we are trying to continue to show a different model, and that model can be effective, because if we're not adaptable in this fast-moving space where the threats are changing moment to moment, then we're not going to be able to do this effectively. So we have to be lean, we have to be able to adapt. And really, the partnership is the best way to be able to keep pace with the emerging tech and with the threat space. And so that's hugely important. just a push. And I know I'm actually speaking to the choir because we have all collaborated together on the botnet report and some of the other partnership things that were mentioned. But there are a lot of stakeholders out there that still aren't participating, and we're still trying to reach smalls and mediums and to get more players into the tent. So, as much as you are all out there being leaders, introducing your suppliers and others to these issues and letting them know the government is interested in partnering. We want, we're doing a new multi-stakeholder process that's now focused on transparency to try to get enterprises more aware of what's going into their software so they can identify vulnerabilities. We're always trying to move that ball forward, but we can't do it alone. And so if we can all as a community get more participation, I think that will continue to help us along.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us here. There's a lot of promising things going on and a lot of exciting things, and I appreciate you guys spending 50 minutes. Maybe next year we'll try and get 2 panels so that we can continue this discussion. But with that, thank you again, and we will conclude this panel.
Thanks, Melanie.